Everyone in the small riverside town of Briar Hollow already knew how the story was supposed to end, because stories like this always did, and people liked endings they could predict. It made them feel safe. But this time they were wrong, though none of them realized it at first. Not on the cold gray afternoon when Daniel Cross stood in the hallway of the county social services building with his 6-year-old son asleep on his shoulder and a paper cup of coffee going cold in his hand, staring at a closed door with a chipped sign that read Child Placement Interview Room B, while whispers passed behind him like drafts through cracked windows, whispers that said things like he'll walk away, no one takes a child like that, he's a single dad, he won't risk it, because behind that door sat a little girl with burned scars running like pale, twisted rivers across one side of her face, down her neck, and disappearing beneath the collar of her sweater, scars that made adults uncomfortable and children stared too long, scars that told a story no one wanted to hear all the way through. Daniel had never planned to be here, not like this, not with his life reduced to a folder of forms and signatures and a tired social worker explaining policies in a voice dulled by repetition, but life had stopped asking for permission the day his wife, Emma, didn't come home from work, and the knock on the door came instead, followed by the words "I'm so sorry and there was an accident," and suddenly Daniel was a single father navigating grief with one hand while trying to keep a small boy named Noah from slipping through the cracks with the other. For 2 years, it had been just the two of them, learning how to live inside the quiet Emma had left behind, learning how to cook meals that didn't taste like loneliness, learning how to answer questions like "Where's mommy?" without breaking something inside themselves, and Daniel told himself that was enough. That their small apartment and mismatched furniture and routine of school pickups and bedtime stories were a complete world. But the truth crept in slowly, usually at night, when Noah slept and Daniel sat alone, realizing that love didn't vanish when it lost someone, it only looked for somewhere else to go. The idea of fostering had come unexpectedly, planted by a flyer Noah brought home from school about children needing temporary homes, and Daniel tried to ignore it at first, because responsibility already weighed heavy on his shoulders and fear whispered that he might fail another person who depended on him, but the thought wouldn't leave, and one evening Noah asked, with the simple cruelty of a child's honesty, "Daddy, can kids be lonely like me?" And Daniel didn't know how to answer without telling the truth, so he said yes, and that was when the door inside him opened, just enough to let the idea in. The social worker, Ms. Alden, had been kind but cautious, explaining options, expectations, boundaries, and then, near the end, she hesitated, fingers tightening around her pen, before mentioning one particular child, a girl named Lily Harper, age 8, history of trauma, permanent facial scarring due to a house fire when she was 5, no surviving immediate family, multiple disrupted placements, behavioral notes including withdrawal, selective mutism under stress, and difficulty forming attachments, and Ms. Alden said all this gently, carefully, like someone laying glass on a table, before adding, "I want to be clear, there's no obligation. Most people choose differently once they understand." Daniel remembered nodding, remembered the way the word differently sounded like a verdict, and he thought he would say no, because no felt safer, because no meant nothing would change, but instead he heard himself ask, "Can I meet her?" And Ms. Alden's eyebrows lifted just a fraction, surprise slipping through professionalism, before she said yes. That was how he ended up standing in the hallway, hearing the whispers, feeling the weight of expectation pressing down on him, expectation that he would see the scars and retreat, that he would think of his son and choose what was easiest, what looked normal from the outside, and Daniel would be lying if he said fear wasn't there, because it was, sharp and insistent, but so was something else, something quieter and stronger, the memory of standing in a hospital room after Emma died, looking at tubes and machines and thinking this isn't what love was supposed to look like, and realizing, too late, that love had never promised beauty or safety, only truth. When the door finally opened and Ms. Alden invited him in, Daniel adjusted Noah on his shoulder and stepped inside, and the room was smaller than he expected, with fluorescent lights and a table covered in crayons no one used anymore, and at the far end sat Lily, legs tucked beneath her chair, hands clenched in the sleeves of her sweater, her unscarred side turned toward the door as if she had learned through repetition which angles hurt less, and for a moment Daniel couldn't breathe, not because of the scars themselves, but because of how carefully she hid, how practiced her stillness was, how it spoke of a child who had learned that being noticed often led to pain. She didn't look up when he entered, and the silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, until Ms. Alden cleared her throat and said, "Lily, this is Daniel. He's here to meet you," and Lily nodded without lifting her eyes, and Daniel felt every lesson he had ever learned about parenting and grief and patience converge into a single moment, because this wasn't about what he said, it was about how he existed in the room, so he crouched slowly, keeping his movements gentle, and said, "Hi, Lily. I'm Daniel. This is my son, Noah." He fell asleep because he thinks grown-up buildings are boring, and there was the faintest twitch at the corner of Lily's mouth, so small it could have been imagined, but Daniel saw it and held onto it like a thread. They didn't talk much that day, because Lily didn't talk much at all, but Daniel stayed longer than required, coloring quietly at the table, letting Noah sleep, not asking questions, not demanding responses, just being present, and when it was time to leave, he stood and thanked her for sharing her crayons, and Lily finally looked up, just for a second, enough for him to see the burn scars fully, raw and uneven, and behind them eyes that were older than 8 had any right to be, and he didn't flinch, not because he was brave, but because he was human, and humans, at their best, recognized pain as familiar. In the weeks that followed, the town watched from a distance as Daniel returned again and again, as reports filtered through the social services grapevine, as neighbors shook their heads and said, "He won't last," because Lily tested boundaries the way children who had been abandoned always did, pulling away, shutting down, sometimes pushing Noah aside without explanation, sometimes retreating into silence so complete it felt like absence, and Daniel went home exhausted more nights than he could count, doubting himself, questioning his motives, wondering if love was enough when scars ran so deep, but every time he thought about stepping back, he remembered Lily's eyes when she realized he wasn't leaving, and he stayed. The day Lily moved in was the day the whispers grew louder, because people saw her then, walking up the stairs to Daniel's apartment, her scars uncovered by the spring air, her grip tight on the strap of her worn backpack, and some looked away. Out of politeness, others out of discomfort, and a few stared, not unkindly, just unprepared, and Daniel felt the weight of their gazes like stones, but he held Lily's suitcase in one hand and Noah's hand in the other and climbed the stairs anyway, because love, he was learning, was not a performance, it was a direction. Living together was not a montage of healing moments or instant bonds. It was messy and slow and often painful, with nights when Lily woke screaming from nightmares she couldn't describe, mornings when she refused to leave her room, days when Noah asked why Lily didn't smile like other kids, and Daniel answered honestly, saying, "Some people have smiles, they're still growing," and Lily listened from the hallway, pretending not to hear, storing the words somewhere deep where hope was dangerous. The scars, too, were part of daily life, part of routines and realities, of doctor visits and curious questions and accidental comments from strangers that cut deeper than intended, and Daniel learned how to step in without making Lily feel small, learned when to explain and when to simply move on, learned that the goal was not to make the world kinder overnight but to make their home a place where she didn't have to be armored, and slowly, imperceptibly, Lily began to change, not into someone else, but into herself, speaking more, laughing sometimes, drawing pictures where faces were whole and bright, and one evening, months after she arrived, she asked Daniel, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Why didn't you say no?" And the room went still, Noah pausing mid-game, the question hanging heavy, and Daniel sat beside her, thinking carefully, before answering, "Because I already knew what it felt like to be left behind. And I didn't want that to be your story too." The turning point came not in private, but in public, because life had a way of testing resolve where it was most visible, at the school open house where Lily attended 3rd grade, where parents filled the gymnasium and children ran between them, and Lily stood frozen at Daniel's side as whispers rose again, as a boy stared too long and another child asked loudly, what happened to her face. And the air seemed to crack with tension, because everyone expected Daniel to redirect, to shield himself, to distance just enough to avoid attention, but instead, he did the simplest and bravest thing he could think of. He reached down and took Lily's hand, holding it firmly, openly, and said, calmly, clearly, "This is Lily. She's my daughter," and in that moment, something shifted, not just for Lily, whose shoulders relaxed for the first time, whose grip tightened in return, but for everyone watching, because love, when shown without apology, had a way of rearranging assumptions. Lily looked up at him then, really looked, and for the first time, she smiled without hiding, scars and all, And the world didn't end, the gym didn't fall silent forever, life went on, but something irreversible had happened, something solid had formed where fear used to live, and from that day forward, Lily walked differently, stood taller, spoke louder, not because the scars disappeared, but because they no longer defined the limits of her belonging. Years later, when Lily stood on a stage at her high school graduation, hair pulled back, scars visible and unhidden, Daniel sat in the crowd beside Noah, who was nearly grown himself, and thought about that first day in the hallway, the whispers, the expectations, the door with the chipped sign, and how close he had come to walking away, and Lily found him in the crowd and smiled, the same smile she had learned to grow, and in that smile was every late night, every doubt, every moment he chose love over fear, and he understood then that the story everyone thought they knew had never really been about scars or rejection at all. It had been about a single choice, made quietly, repeatedly, to hold a child's hand when the world expected him to let go.